welcome to the third part of the pruning video series. Let's look at some examples. In this example, we're cutting a very large branch off the main leader of the tree. Now, when I make this cut, I will actually be diverting a large amount of sap or energy into the rest of the tree. Now, since the area of the tree above the cut doesn't currently have a branch, the response will most likely be to push the dormant buds above the cut, and the buds will form from new branches. Now in this scenario, you will notice that there are way too many fruit buds on this branch. Remember that apples are about the size of your fist, and also quite heavy by the time they get picked. Now a good question to ask yourself is, how many apples can I realistically have on this branch? Often, I will see branches left far too long for the size that they are. Now pruning is actually far faster than hand thinning fruit that is left on the trees. So prune the extra potential fruit off now. Now that I've pruned this whole tree, let's count all of the obvious buds to get an idea of how many pieces of fruit that I may have left at harvest time. Now remember, each fruit bud will have 5 flowers that should blossom. However, you usually only want to keep 1 flower per bud. Now in the event that you end up pruning too many fruit buds off, you do still have the option of keeping 2 pollinated flowers, which will probably turn into fruit. Now, double apples are not ideal, but they can save you in a pinch. In the commercial production of apples, it is very important to double check your crop load. And you gotta do that once in a while. Make sure you count those buds. Why? It has the potential of saving you a lot of time and money down the road. Prune the trees right now, as the investment will pay you back in spades later to maximize size and crop load. You will notice in some of the pruning scenarios I was just showing you, I was actually making different angled cuts, as well as choosing the location of the cut. Although it may seem trivial, the angle of the cut can be almost as important as the location sometimes. There are 3 main types of actual cuts. We already talked about the flush cut, but I have a couple really important tips about the specific cut. Make sure that the top of the flush cut is almost right against the adjacent branch, but the bottom of the cut must be angled out to leave some cambium or bark. Now this extra little bit of bark around the bottom of the cut allows the wound to heal much faster, and therefore reduces the chance of an open wound getting infected. We also briefly mentioned this stub cut. It is pretty much just a straight flat cut, and there's nothing too special about it. Now the stub leaves potential for branches to come out of the same area, and is usually used when the pruner may think that there are not other good options for new branches to push from buds nearby. Now the bench cut is an odd looking cut. This particular cut follows a similar rationale to the stub cut, and that it is used when there are not other good options nearby for branches to form from buds. The difference from the stub though, is there is less of a chance that the new branch coming from the underside of the bench cut will be vigorous. So, if you have a larger sized branch that you would like to take out but don't think there are other options nearby, then the stub cut may be your answer. But be careful though. If the branch is too strong, like over 50% of the trunk, even the bench cut may result in a new branch that is still too strong. Now if you think this is going to be the case, flush cut the branch instead. Alright, let's get back into talking about other common pruning questions. One of the most common questions I get is, what do I do with the tops of the trees? Well, when a tree has a reasonable amount of vigor, the energy or sap tries to shoot for the moon. Often, the tree will put energy into multiple branches or leaders that seem to be all in a race for the sky. Now you have a few options. You can cut all the top branches off except for the weak leader and then leave the leader alone. Or 2, you can cut all of the top branches off except for one more vigorous leader and then tie it down. Or 3, you can cut all of the branches off and leave nothing. Now, each one of these methods has their own advantages and disadvantages, but my personal favorite method is to leave just one weak leader and then walk away. It probably requires the least amount of work and still leaves an outlet for the extra energy of the tree. Most likely, the tree will push this little leader hard in the growing season, but then you can choose a new leader to prune next year. So another common question I get is, what is the difference between a spur type variety and a tip bearer? Well, most varieties of apple trees grow very different from one another. Just because you prune one variety one way and get a certain response does not mean that every other variety will be the same. Ambrosia or Gala, for example, would be classified more under the spur type of varieties, meaning that they will set up fruit spurs quite quickly and close to the main leader on small wood. Pink Lady or Fuji would be an example of a tip bearer, as they will often throw out long branches and then set up fruit buds right at the end of the branch. So this is good information for you to know when you're pruning. For example, if you end up pruning a newer Pink Lady block and tip or head most of the branches, most likely you will end up not having much of a crop, as you probably pruned off most of the buds without knowing it. So another question is, when should I prune? Now, early on, I briefly discussed when pruning should be done, but let's talk about it in a bit more detail, as it's actually a little bit more complicated than you may think. Most often, pruning is done when trees are dormant. You can usually tell that a deciduous tree is dormant once it loses its leaves. If you live in a part of the world where winter can be quite cold, say minus 10 degrees Celsius or colder, or where there can be quick temperature swings, it is often best to wait until the coldest part of the winter is over, to lessen the possibility of winter injury. If the trees experience winter injury, some of the branches will die back, most often from the tips. If you have already pruned the tree before this injury occurs, you may end up with multiple dead branch sections in your trees. Now, this is not a great way to start out with the growing season. Some orchard operations are simply too big to get all the pruning done in the late winter or early spring timings. In these cases, the pruning crew will often start pruning as soon as the leaves fall off the trees and hope for a mild winter. If you have the luxury of waiting for slightly warmer weather to start pruning and live in a cold climate, it is best to take it. Now, the other thing is speed. Like any other operation on your orchard, speed is critical. I have seen some pruners out there that make excellent cuts, but are so slow that it feels like you're watching paint dry. If you are newer to pruning, you're most likely to be fairly slow for the first while, and that's okay when you're learning, as there's many considerations to make. One of my professors in university simply stated that you must be able to defend each and every cut you make on a tree. Now, this statement is very true, but you need to make the decision quick and then move on, as there will most likely be many more cuts that need to be made before the spring arrives. In our next episode, we'll be talking about which tools are best for pruning and how to properly maintain those tools, which includes sharpening. Also, I will be talking about extension poles, ladders, and platforms to help you take your pruning to the next level. Check it out.